My uncle died alone, and it took a while before we found him. It's sad to think about it, but that's the way it was. After he missed a few days of work, his employer called his emergency contact, his ex-wife who had moved out of state. And then she called my mom, and the two of us went to his house. His car was still there. Mail had piled up a bit. The door was locked. I broke in and soon found him in the basement as my mom waited in the sunlit kitchen, staring anxiously down the dark mouth of the basement stairwell. The memory is painful, and it's not the point of the story. Or at least, I don't think it is. The next few days were a blur, but at some point I went back to his house to start packing up his stuff. And that's when I saw the box of tapes with my name on it. Literally, my name was written on the box in block letters. These were meant for me. Maybe as a gift he was planning on giving me. Or maybe he just left them here for me to find. It was a box of movies, the kind he'd loved, sci-fi mostly, all still sealed, with a few open thrillers thrown in. I flipped through them quickly, as I had a lot to do. They all seemed both familiar, but at the same time, odd. I hadn't seen or heard of any of them. It was strange. Everything about that day seemed strange. But there was something else in the box as well. Something that caught my eye and wiped the movies from my mind. It was a note. Also written to me. An apology for what he'd done. What he knew we would eventually find in the basement. It was a plea for understanding. It was a warning about the movies. That he'd watched a few of them and that he was scared of what he'd found. He wrote that he couldn't destroy them and that he'd had to share them with someone, but begged me not to watch any of the tapes that were unopened. This line was underlined 3 times. And then, at the end of the note, below his signature, almost as an afterthought, he wrote that he loved me, that he'd always wished that he had a son like me. And although he'd given up, he hoped that I never would. It was a sad and confused note, written by a sad and confused man. A man I had loved in the sort of distracted way you love the family that's not your immediate family. A man that none of us had loved enough, obviously. I cried then, with the note in my hand and the box of movies on my lap. Movies that must have meant something to him. And for that reason, at that moment, they meant everything to me. My uncle was a strange, quirky character that had difficulty relating to people, difficulty with relationships, and had trouble making friends. My dad had been his best friend. My mom told me that after my father passed, my uncle started coming around, trying to be a replacement father, I guess, and hoping he'd be a type of replacement brother. We'd go on long walks and bike rides, and he talked to me a lot about my dad. He'd even cry sometimes. Even years after, I was pretty much over my father's death, and he'd take me to the movies. He loved movies, and I guess he made me love them too. It was the way that we connected. Sitting next to him in the theater, it felt almost as if I had a dad again. Together in the theater, the two of us explored a universe of ideas, and some of my fondest childhood memories involved the cinema, and featured him right by my side. When a person dies the way my uncle did, fond memories are often tainted. Every memory is unwillingly associated with the way their life ended, the decision they made. You have this memory that tapers into a sharp point, the end of which stabs your heart. Does that make sense? Probably not. Not much does at a time like this. The movies he'd left, though, seemed both a gift from beyond and a way to enjoy his company while watching something new. So a few weeks later, I reopened the box and pulled out one of the movies at random. One he'd opened and presumably watched as well. It was called 911, and it featured a young Bruce Willis on the cover as a fireman, presumably, and it had 2 burning towers in the background. Do you see where this is going? I paused the movie at the point where the towers came down. The scene was too eerily reminiscent of the actual event. I examined the box the movie came in and saw that it came out in '86. I felt my scalp start to tingle. Obviously, this movie inspired the terrorists. I Googled it to see if anyone else had shared the same opinion online, but I couldn't find any mention of the movie at all. Though the box art looked similar to the art for Die Hard, which came out a few years later. I ejected the tape and popped in another. It was an early '80s sci-fi comedy called Cosmic Riders, featuring Andy Kaufman as the leader of a quirky congregation planning on being picked up by a spaceship. They all killed themselves at the end. I swear to God, smiling as they drank the poison, all set to the song Land Down Under. While the credits rolled, you could see them dancing around on a cloud with stars zipping by in the background. But it was wrong and frightening. Their white robes had vomit stains. Their smiling, laughing faces looked pale, and the eyes looked dead. It was a comedy about the Heaven's Gate cult, produced more than 15 years before it happened. I started to cry, feeling hot tears spilling over my numb face. There was no record of this movie anywhere online either. I started grabbing open tapes at random, fast-forwarding through them in morbid fascination. I could identify the events they'd predicted by the box art, but I had to see it to believe. Though I had no idea what to believe. This is what I saw. A teen comedy called High School Massacre, in which Alex Winter and Keanu Reeves, clothed in black trench coats, shoot up their classmates. The effects were disturbingly realistic, and I stopped the movie after seeing a young Winona Ryder get shot in the chest, pausing it right as she flew backwards, her eyes wide, and her chest a gaping red hole, like a second shocked mouth about to spill out a horrible secret. There was also another comedy called Bronco Run, in which Billy D. Williams is a retired football player who brutally kills his wife and her lover on screen, stabbing them over and over again while laughing maniacally before leading the law on a madcap, hijinks-filled race across LA. There were more thrillers, fictional reenactments, pre-enactments, I guess, of events that had shocked the nation and the world, set to nostalgic soundtracks featuring familiar, impossibly young faces, faking emotions that would become a horribly real future in 20 years or so. The impossible movies I watched or forwarded through, all the open thrillers, late into the night, laughing, perhaps hysterically, and crying, trying to research them online on my phone, finding nothing. No record that any of them had been made. no sign that they ever existed. It was just me, this box, these movies, and a flickering screen, suddenly cut adrift from the sane and familiar world. Those were the open movies. The remaining movies, still sealed, leaned more towards science fiction, all featuring apocalyptic wastelands and star-faring civilizations. But there were two unopened movies that were an exception. They looked like political thrillers. One is a comedy called Small Hands. It's a black and white movie directed by Stanley Kubrick about a stolen election and a nuke-obsessed president suffering from dementia, played by John Lithgow in an obvious toupee. On the back of the box art, it has a view from space of mushroom clouds blossoming across the globe. Reviews on the box call it a hilariously dark vision of the future. The other looks like a crime thriller. It's called The American's Last Hope, starring Clint Eastwood as a formerly retired special agent tasked with bringing down a corrupt administration. On the box cover, looming over Clint, is John Lithgow's glowing face in the clouds, his glaring brow overhung by the same ridiculous toupee he's wearing in Small Hands. Reviews on the back of the box call it a bold vision of the future and a triumph of justice over corruption. Neither box has been opened, and on both, the factory seal remains unbroken. I don't understand how all of this works. I don't know what to do. Does the sheer fact that these movies even exist mean that these things will all have to happen? Does watching the movies make the future events occur? The unopened sci-fi movies in the cardboard box hint at wildly different futures. Are those two movies in my hands the different paths before us? Would watching one negate the other? I've been sitting here for hours, and the sun has risen and is shining through the blinds, scattering bars of light across the half-watched tapes and open boxes. The VHS player is waiting, its tape slot a gaping mouth, waiting to be fed, waiting for the future, just like the rest of us.